Welcome to the DaVinci Hour Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Maxwell Cooper, and in this podcast series, I interview physicians, medical innovators, and entrepreneurs making an impact on healthcare. This podcast is produced by DaVinci Academy, a multimedia medical education company that provides podcasts, video courses, and digital textbooks. You can see more on our website, www.dviacademy.com, and our YouTube channel, youtube.com/c/DaVinci Academy Med. This podcast is sponsored by Doc2Doc, the personal lending platform designed for doctors by doctors. Do you have some big expenses in the near future? Maybe you're moving, applying to residency or fellowship, fixing up your car or home, or starting a new practice. Doc2Doc believes that traditional lenders overestimate the risk of lending money to doctors, residents, and medical students, focusing too much on the challenges of their financial past and giving them insufficient credit for the promise of their financial future. Check out Doc2Doc's personal loan options at doc2doclending.com/DaVinci. Hey everybody, welcome back to the DaVinci Hour Podcast. I'm honored this week to be joined by a fellow physician podcaster, Dr. Eric Gantwerker. He is one of the hosts over at the Backtable Innovation Show, and then he's also a pediatric ENT on Long Island in academic practice there at Cohen Children's Hospital. And then he's also involved in a medical education company called Level X. He's one of the VPs and medical director there. So Eric, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on. Big fan.
Awesome. Thank you. So I gave you a little bit of an intro, but maybe talk about where you went to school, where you did residency, and just like a general overview of your clinical practice.
Yeah. So I was a little atypical everywhere throughout my career, but I didn't even know if I wanted to do medicine. So I was actually a chemical engineer before I actually even went to medical school, and then sort of got interested in food science and chemical engineering because my uncle worked for Quaker Oats, and I became an EMT and then a medic firefighter. After college, I basically went and got a master's degree as a postbac program at Georgetown University with a master's in physiology and biophysics. And basically then, sort of got into medical school. I'm from Chicago, so I went to Rush Medical College, which is actually where my brother went. So me trying to do the opposite of what he did, ended up doing, following in similar footsteps. He became a neurosurgeon, so I was kind of the dumb one in the family. So I was like, oh, well, I'll do ENT. So I did my ENT residency at Cincinnati and Cincinnati Children's, and was really interested in pediatrics, and so went on to do my fellowship at Boston Children's. And then got a master's degree in medical education because it was starting up right then. And really, it was the first year of the program, so really could make it what I wanted to. So focused mostly on the cognitive science of learning and adult learning theory, but then also on educational technology and where the overlap was. And then really got involved in game-based learning and took some courses up there. And really that sort of jettisoned me into my career as it is today.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's quite you've been around, that's for sure. I'm curious, you do pediatric ENT right now, and when you splitting time between that and the company you work at, I guess when you are practicing, what's like are you mostly operative? Do you kind of split between clinic and like any particular areas you focus on?
Yeah, coming out of Cincinnati, we're really well trained in airway, so that was sort of my first foray into it. And I really like doing airway and sleep surgery and, more of the complex aerodigestive kids. So that's sort of where I gravitated my practice. I was at Boston Children's for a year while I was doing my master's program, and then went to Dallas. I was at Dallas Children's for two and a half years. And then I was in Chicago at Loyola for about 2.5 years, and then moved to Northwell about 2 years ago. Most of the academic practice in pediatric ENT, the bigger they get, the more you subspecialize. Our group's a little bit different where pretty much everybody does everything. So we sort of split everything, but airway and sleep is sort of still my area of interest, and sort of that aerodigestive kids with tracheostomies and those types of things. And you asked about the split. Most of the time, my 3 days is either split 2 days clinic, 1 day OR, or sometimes 2 days OR, 1 day clinic. It really depends. And then I do some weekends and stuff, but I have a really pretty good mix of both.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great way to split your week, both OR, clinic, and then obviously doing, entrepreneurship, which is awesome. Yeah. So I'm curious, how did you get interested in like medical education? You did a master's in it. Obviously you're working at a company that's on the cutting edge of it right now. Was that something you had wanted to do, or was it kind of opportunities presented themselves and you kind of took advantage of those and got more interested?
Yeah, a little bit of both. So my dad was a Chicago public school teacher, and he told me, whatever I do, don't become a teacher. So I did the opposite and became a teacher. So, I really always had it in me. I was always interested in education. And throughout my career, I had, different elements of my life doing tutoring or teaching residents or teaching medical students. And so I've always had that as part of me. When the opportunity came to actually do a master's in med ed, people were asking me, like, why do you want to do this? Why don't you do, a public health or an MBA? And I was like, no, really education is my thing. I really, really enjoy education. And that's what sort of got me into that space initially, was like, I do want to develop the skill set, but I also want to have some credentials, which would be nice. But then getting the practical skills of doing a thesis on some kind of educational topic. And then I just sort of gravitated, because I think everybody gravitates towards something that they're good at. And then all of a sudden they become passionate about the things that they're good at. So I sort of felt like I had a little bit of a track record of doing pretty well with it. And then you enjoy it more as you get positive feedback, I guess. And so that was sort of what got me into that space. And this master's was just sort of a natural progression of that.
That's awesome. And then I'm curious, how did that lead to getting involved in Level X? Had you been involved in, using education technology and new tools in education, or I guess, how did you get involved in that?
That's a great question. I've always been interested in games, and games have always fascinated me since, my brother and I were kids and played video games. And one funny anecdote was that when we grew up playing games, he was older than me. So whenever I messed up in the game, he slapped my hand. And then I actually got the opportunity to rotate with him, and he was my chief resident and I was a fourth year medical student, and we were operating together, and I did something stupid and he slapped my hand. So it was sort of like playing games again. But that the whole idea of games and learning was very fascinating to me. And again, it was sort of like what you said, like the opportunity comes, you take the opportunity and you like it. And that's sort of what happened. So the game-based learning stuff that I learned in product development, user-centered design, was sort of an amalgamation of what my master's was. And then the opportunities to consult within the technology and education space in medicine came. I had multiple opportunities, and a lot of them I still do with some consulting that I do. But one of them was this company, Level X, which at the time was started by my friend who is the CEO. We've known each other since we went to high school together, we went to college together. So we've known each other for a long time. And then he sort of went off and did his own thing, working for LucasArts, Microsoft, and sort of making video games. And he actually he was CEO of a mobile video game company that was making Hollywood movies, Hollywood movie games, so all the games that are based on that. And it just so happened that I graduated when he started the company. And so he said, would you like to advise for us? Because one of the first things they were doing was airway in the anesthesia space, which there's a lot of overlap with ENT. And then as they expanded into new specialties, my role grew. And then when they became, a larger company, they needed a medical director. And so that's when I sort of made the move to Chicago, also being home for my parents. It was a good time. And then that role just expanded from there.
Wow, that's interesting. I mean, that's kind of a perfect, synergy of things happening all at once. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I was going to say, like, how did you get, when you were doing these consulting jobs, like, how did you, obviously this guy was a friend of yours from a long time ago, but I guess maybe some of the other opportunities you had, was that something you just were good at, kind of networking in the space, or did people reach out to you? I guess, how did you come across those type of opportunities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think part of it is definitely networking and getting your presence out there. And when there are people doing stuff in a cool, interesting space, they share their network with you. And so, even stuff that I post on social media, I get attention. I consult for about 2 or 3 companies that literally reached out to me on LinkedIn just from my presence and my background. Some of it is warm introductions. So some people will be like, hey, you'd really jive with, you'd really get along with this person. Maybe you should reach out and connect. And that was it's been sort of organic at this point. I don't really seek out that many opportunities. There are some that seem interesting to me and I reach out, but it's more the network and being open to meeting people. And one of the things I found in this space that we may get to is that this medical education and medical technology space right now is so collaborative that you could link in, message somebody, and they'll get back to you no matter what level. Like, I message CEOs all the time of big companies and they get back to me. People are they're wanting to connect in this space and they're wanting to push the field forward. And I think it's a very fruitful and collaborative environment, as opposed to a lot of some of these other spaces where people are really closed in and protective of their secrets. This is slightly different than that.
Yeah, no, that's pretty cool. I think, as I was telling you, I've done some video court video courses and medical education. And kind of in that world, I've definitely been able to collaborate with some other companies. And yeah, I agree with you. It's not as competitive as you may think with, maybe you see in some other spaces. I think that's pretty cool. Everyone coming together for a good cause, which is medical education.
Absolutely. And just asking for advice.
Sure.
Even reaching out to people who, again, in higher places than I, just asking for advice. And people are so open to that opportunity and that mentorship relationship. It's been fantastic for me. And again, those networking and the connections coming from just having conversations has gone a long way. And obviously, as you've noticed in the podcasting environment as well, just meeting with people on your show, you get to connect with those individuals and then expand your network further, which has been a fantastic opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah. I definitely didn't even really think of that as something when I started podcasting. It's amazing the network and, group of, I have people I stay in touch with that on the show, like, fairly regularly, through LinkedIn messages or Instagram or things like that. So it's a pretty cool kind of side product of it. It's pretty cool. Maybe give us an overview of, we've been talking about Level X. Maybe give us an overview, like, what it is you guys do, like maybe like a 30,000 foot overview, and then we can kind of get into the nitty gritty details, but maybe like an overview of, what you guys are working on.
Yeah. So, we think of ourselves as the medical video game studio, and essentially our mission is to advance the practice of medicine through play. And that really sort of underlines what we're trying to do. What we're trying to use the technology and the psychology of video games that are so strong and so cutting edge to reimagine how healthcare professionals engage with medically relevant content. So that is mostly in sort of the continuing professional development CME space, but also understanding how different technologies, new things that are coming on the market, how those apply to your patient population. And it's not even just restricted to doctors. We're now doing stuff in the patient education space. We're doing stuff in the nursing space. So we're really expanding that target audience, but our core audience has always been continuing professional development and CME. But the number one thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to increase access and lower cost to the end users. And so our stuff is completely free to download and play. Anybody can play it today. And that was really the genius of our CEO, Sam, and what the way he imagined was that the content should be free. It should be accessible on your device at all times, just-in-time learning, micro-learning, all the things that we're talking about now. He thought of that, 7-8 years ago.
That's pretty cool. And I think it might have been the episode where you interviewed him, or maybe one of the other episodes you did when you're talking about it, that was something he took from his experience in the video game industry, that you can still make it free to the end user, but still monetize it and make it a good business model. I'm curious, like how that's carried over for you guys in terms of the business model.
100%. And it's a very different business model from what most people have done. In fact, when I meet with people from a business development standpoint, that's the number one question. Like, wait a minute, it's free? Like, how do you monetize? How do you scale? And then we talk about it and they're like, oh my God, that's genius. And we're like, yeah, I mean, a lot of free platforms do that, right? I mean, so Instagram does that, Facebook does that, right? But they do it through banner ads and serving you content that is, something that you'll look at for 5 seconds. Level X does it in a way that we take that content and we create an experience that you're going to engage with, for 10 minutes instead of looking at it for 30 seconds. So the value proposition to our potential clients and partners is much higher than what it would be on a Facebook or an Instagram.
Interesting. So are those partners, are they like the medical device companies and like, I guess, other like medical equipment companies? Is like one, I guess, to help educate doctors on how to use them and but also a marketing, play in that they, you're aware that these are out there.
All of these things. I mean, we partner with clients from NGOs, nonprofits. We work with TRISH, which is the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, which is out of Baylor, affiliated with NASA. And, that was a grant program. So we do grant-based work as well. We work with societies, organizations, and, anybody who's looking to innovate in this space and use our toolbox is the way that we think about it. And obviously from industry as well. And industry is coming out with new devices and new medications. And the problem is that patient outcomes aren't as great if people aren't using them correctly. And so we're really trying to change the way that people know about those things, know how to use them correctly, so that we can hopefully improve patient outcomes, but then also make people aware of these tools and these new therapeutics.
Very cool. Very cool. And so I guess how do people play these games? Is it virtual reality? Is it like a game console? Like, do they, I guess maybe walk us through how the user experience, if you will.
So, the beginning of the company, Sam, remember, was at a mobile game company. So he wanted to be mobile first. So all of our games, when they first came out, were all mobile based. So you're using the touchscreen on your phone because, again, you want to increase access and decrease cost. We realized that as we grew as a company, that there's other channels that people want to utilize. Very early in the pandemic, we created a gaming platform that is cloud-based. And you can actually distribute our stuff any way you want. You can do it in VR, you can do it in AR, you can do it web-based, you can do it on an iPad, you can do it on your iPhone. We can integrate with proprietary hardware. So one of the things that was the smartest thing that I would say our company did was we were omni-channel. You can play our stuff anywhere, anytime, and we can integrate. We didn't go whole hog into virtual reality or any of these other spaces because there's limitations that VR has, and specifically access and cost are those limitations. And if you think about it from a distribution model, beholding yourself to distributing hardware is a tough business. But if you could just create the software and integrate with whatever hardware it is, that's a much better business, but also it's much better for the end user because they can meet you where you're at. And so our solutions are deployed on our mobile. It can be integrated with an LMS. It could be on any PC, any web-based that has a Wi-Fi. It could be VR. It could be any display or any proprietary hardware. And that's really such a great thing that our company did early on to realize that that was a better method of distribution.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. And I like the idea of increasing access. And then, yeah, I think some of these tools like VR and they're very cool. And, I've demoed them out, as I'm sure you have, but they have their limitations, like you said. And then the cost that's a huge issue as well that you pointed out. Are you integrating these with like residency programs or medical schools? I guess, do you see this as something that's being either currently or potentially adopted into curriculums? And I guess if so, how do you see that fitting into the curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously from the business side, we moved first in sort of that CPD focus, CME focus, just because of our existing partners and clients. As we grow as a company and we realize the potential of the power of the tools that we have, it's very obvious that medical students, residents, anybody who's a clinician or an allied health professional can take advantage of these tools. And so we've started to go into some of that curriculum development for residents. We have a new product coming down that is specifically targeted towards that. So we do feel like our tool set is very, very set for that type of experience, while we're also trying to create a business that will support the R&D for those projects, because the money is a little bit tighter in that population. It's a much longer cycle to try to realize and issue those projects through. So there's a really important business consideration as you go to that model, because again, we're not subscription based. So we're not going to recoup costs from the users, which is what a lot of some of those companies do. You're not going to do a subscription base from the university, which is a lot of what some of them do. Our business model is very different from that. And so we try to stay true to our business, but then also create the R&D cycle such that we can deliver those solutions for more novice users.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. I'm curious, what kind of like, I guess, feedback or do you guys have you done any like studies or data to kind of demonstrate, because I think it's cool that it's also a game, kind of, it fuels that competitive aspect that a lot of people have, and especially if they're a former athlete or a musician or something like that, it kind of fuels that fire as well.
Yeah. So, as a company, obviously we always want to show that it works, right? We do know that games work. Games are a very powerful learning tool that have existed for millennia. And to harness that power into these game-based learning type experiences is extremely important. And you bring up competition, which is really important. That's one motivator of some people. Not everybody's motivated by competition, which is why sometimes some of these gamification type things don't work, because they're predicated on competition, and not everybody's motivated through competition. We're sort of taking that next level down, which is that deep psychology of games and why people play games for hours on end, even if there's not competition as part of that element. But when we look at how people learn, that's the more important part. Can they learn with the game? Can they apply that into clinical practice? The answer is yes. So we have lots of studies that have shown our stuff works. We have several studies that were done on early prototypes of what we were creating with the Airway X, and even on the precursor for Airway X. We actually just launched a white paper, or actually we had a third-party study that was ran and just released a white paper about our knowledge-based mechanics, and showing that amongst practicing clinicians who were busy, They actually improved their score in just 30 minutes. They played for 2 hours, and they can then actually apply that into clinical relevant scenario so that we know that they're likely going to transfer that into practice, which is extremely important, something very different than what a lot of the research has shown. Again, as an educational researcher at heart, I always want things to be external to us. And so we are predicated on outside PIs running a lot of our studies. We run some internal data studies, mostly for our QA, just to make sure that we are creating stuff that is hitting the mark and modifying our games as we need to. And so we generate a lot of data in that way. But really, these outside third-party studies are really important for us to be able to run. And there's a bunch of studies that are in the pipeline as well. But yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. These games are fun, but do they show outcomes? And that's going to be where the rubber meets the road. And you have to show those outcomes in order for people to be confident that games work, because there still is some cynicism out there. And I think that is something that the whole industry needs to do, is to push that forward and show that proof.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you point that out about the data definitely shows that it works, but there is a little bit of skepticism, because I was going to ask you about that. Like, as well as I do that, medicine, especially in medical education, can be very, slow to change or accept new ways of doing things. So I'm curious, like, what kind of skepticism or criticism or pushback you've gotten, and how you guys have mitigated that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's all over the place, but I think it is slowly changing. Part of it is that a lot of people think about who starts medical school now, right? So you start medical school when you're 22 years old. So these people were born in 2001, the people who are starting medical school. So they have not known a world without technology. They've not known a world almost without mobile games. So gaming is now not what it used to be. When people who were 60 years old knew what games were, it was Pong. It was, these games that really were not necessarily ubiquitous as they are now. The average age of a gamer is like 36 years old now. It's not like 10. The 2.6 billion people play video games. 2.6 billion people.
That's crazy.
This is not just people in their basement playing games, and they engage with these games for thousands of hours. There's something to that, and remember, nobody's forcing them to play the game. Like, games are an opt-in experience. If you're not having fun, you're going to stop playing. There is something about games. There's a magic there that is happening. And medical education is starting to realize that, and the younger people are coming through and have access to tools to create games, because that's the other thing, user-generated content, right? Before, it was only game designers could do it. Now you have game engines like Unity, which are much more user-friendly, visual authoring tools, Game Maker Plus. You have all these tools that users can create their own games, and they are. And we're starting to see this populate into the universe of medical education in little pockets. And it's starting to create this movement. I mean, the whole serious games movement has been a big discussion point. You see gamification everywhere. We can argue the merits of serious games and gamification, whether they're actually entertaining or not, but that's a whole nother discussion. I think people are realizing, hey, there's something here. There's potential here. The other area that I've actually gotten really interested in is escape rooms. Just the idea that you could use your knowledge to do puzzles and do escape rooms. And now you're seeing that pop up all over the literature. You started mostly in nursing now, but now it's coming into medical education, and it's just popping up everywhere because people realize that games are fun, they're interesting, and they are a great model for how we want people to learn. We want them to be curious. We want them to be challenged. They want the challenge to meet their skill. They want to create a flow state where they're so concentrated that they lose hours on end doing this. And it's the maximally efficient way that people learn.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think it's enjoying the experience, feeling like you're getting something out of it. And then also, the escape room, we actually did an escape room in my resident orientation.
Oh, really? That's awesome.
Yeah. So that's funny.
We definitely got to talk about that.
Yeah. So that's funny you brought that up. It was cool. It was a good team building experience and bonding experience. So that's pretty cool. I want to ask you though, just to get a little bit in the specifics, maybe could you give us like an example of one of the games, like how it works, how do you win or lose, and then like what's the educational like objective that you hope the user gets out of it?
The patient survives. That's how you win. So when we first started, again, realized that we're trying to marry the psychology of video games and the technology. And so when you're using the technology from video games, it has to be very visual. And so when we started creating games for Level X, it was very procedural focused. So our first game was Airway X, which was for anesthesiologists to teach them flexible fiber optic intubation. And so you're literally using the touchscreen, and you have 6 degrees of freedom with the touchscreen like you would on the scope, right? You can rotate it right, you can rotate it left, you can thumb up, thumb down, you can advance it in and advance it out. So you have 6 degrees of freedom. The same thing is just mapped onto your touchscreen. And so you're navigating through the back of the nose, back of the throat. You're trying to intubate the patient because that's the ultimate goal of flexible fiber optic intubation. And you're seeing all these massive lesions and you're trying to navigate around them. And then we have some more abstract things like you're going through a maze and going through a puzzle and you're collecting hearts. Some are more of those game type experiences where you're using those skills that you need to transfer into clinical practice, but your goal of the level is not to gain those skills. So I always talk about this in when games are working really well, the goal of the game is tangential to the skills that you're developing and the ultimate learning objectives that you're trying to achieve. Because people don't want to know that like, oh, I learned something. Like that's not their end goal. So collecting hearts is a tangential goal. But in order for you to collect those hearts, you need to navigate the bronchial tree just right and not cause any damage. And so that's how we score people based on time, based on skill, collateral damage, which is exactly how it maps to in real life. Like you don't want to mess up the airway. You don't want to cause inflammation. We had PulmX, which was again a interventional bronchoscopy type game where you're doing foreign bodies, you're taking biopsies. GastroX was actually our second title, which was colonoscopies. And again, trying to use your touchscreen to map to those degrees of freedom that you would have on the actual devices. And then we started moving into more knowledge-based mechanics. So we have a diagnosis mechanic where you're diagnosing disease, a treatment mechanic where you're going through the patient journey and treating them and seeing how their side effects are, how their quality of life is, those types of things. And we've even further expanded into puzzle type games. Our top derm game, which is for dermatology, is a very visually focused knowledge challenge type game where you're doing matching, you're doing all kinds of different knowledge-based mechanics. We have a game mechanic where you're trying to determine if a patient meets a certain criteria of a disease entity. We have some games that are focused on mechanism of action, mechanisms of disease that are more molecular-based interactions where you're finger painting on the screen and creating these molecular interactions and seeing them evolve over time. So we started with this sort of procedural based game, and now we have 10 different mechanics now of how we can assemble instruments and all these types of things. So they're all very different, which is why I always say level X is not a thing, it's a toolbox. And that's really what we're trying to build. We're trying to build a toolbox by going into different specialties, working with different partners and different clients.
Very cool. Very cool. And then, I know you mentioned this before, but how when you have like the partners or the, people, companies that want to partner with you and, have their, technology featured or their brand featured, how does that all work into the game as well?
Yeah, it depends. So, with any partner or client, we do a very in-depth intake about what their goals that they're trying to achieve and who is their audience, right? Because their audience isn't always the same. It may not be usually healthcare professionals, but they might have sales training. They might need to train their sales force. And so that solution is very different from getting in front of healthcare professionals and showcasing the value proposition of their devices or just showing how they work and preventing side effects. So early on, we had a medication that we created content for, and the problem was that people were not dosing it correctly, and they were getting lots of side effects. And so we created basically an Angry Birds type game, where you're trying to set it and you're trying to manage it to make sure that you don't cause those side effects, and you start to understand, okay, if I don't go above this level, and it has a very narrow therapeutic window. So, if you stay within that narrow therapeutic window, you're not going to cause damage. You're not going to cause problems. And so we created just a whole game based on that concept. There's some where, you're managing multiple patients at the same time and you're trying to keep them under a certain level of anesthesia, and you have a tool that helps you determine their level of anesthesia. And so you're trying to manage all these patients with all their medications, and some of them, the tool's not working. And so you see it's much harder to manage those patients without that tool. And so just with that tool, you start to realize, now I can monitor them a lot better than some of the other ways that I did. And so sometimes it's sort of featuring their product, understanding how their product works, understanding how to put their product together, right? So sometimes it's just, I don't know how to put this together because this is something brand new to me. Sometimes it's an awareness, just understanding the disease entities that we're starting to think about. We worked with the IPF Foundation because IPF, interstitial pulmonary fibrosis, is a often missed diagnosis. And so we worked with the IPF Foundation and got a grant to actually try to get healthcare professionals to recognize IPF earlier, order high-res CT scans earlier, and recognize the changes on high-res CTs that would map to somebody who would have IPF instead of something else. And so we're also starting to do these rare diseases where people are just sort of missing the diagnosis. These patients goes months and years without a diagnosis, and their outcomes are much poorer because doctors are not recognizing earlier on, this isn't what you think it is, it's something else.
That's really fascinating. I mean, the whole user experience. It sounds like everything's integrated together, both for the user and then the company that you're partnering with to feature as well. That's really cool. And it's kind of everybody wins. I mean, the user gets better knowledge of what the company has to offer, and then the company obviously gets their product out there and seen, and then also people know how to use it better, which is also pretty cool as well. I'm curious, what you guys have recently been acquired by BrainLab, is that right? And then
yeah,
I guess what kind of what was the reason, I guess, for that acquisition? And then I guess has that changed anything? Or are you guys still operating kind of with the same mission, or do you guys have new goals you're trying to attain now?
Yeah, I mean, it was great. I mean, it actually happened during COVID, which was fantastic. So we had been doing some work with BrainLab before, and they had sort of known us. And Sam and the CEO of BrainLab really got to know each other really, really well throughout everything that we've been doing before. And again, what we really pride ourselves on is the quality of our technology and the quality of our interactions that you are having inside the game. It doesn't just look pretty. There's a whole infrastructure underneath that's actually running. So the example I give is in our CardioX game, you're actually looking through X-ray wavelength light through a human model. And that is not painted. That is an actual representation of a real-time rendering of how those light passes through that form, such that if we change the light intensity, the form will change. But it also allowed us to create these lesions within the cardiac network that when you look at them under the fluoroscopic light, they show as if they would in real life. And that is, again, just the technology that's running on the underside of what we do. And BrainLab, at the end of the day, is a very cutting edge technology company. And they saw the opportunities and, some of the technology that we have, and saw the potential to get into this, this different space and using the tool set that we have. And so it just sort of naturally progressed into this conversation. And, we were very happy that everything went down the way it did. And Stefan Vilsmeyer, CEO of BrainLab, has been a fantastic advocate, and him and Sam are very, very close. And what the thing it did for us was, Sam, obviously as a startup, was on the road a lot trying to get us funding. And just the constant startup life of trying to be like, where's our next dollar going to come from? What's our run rate? It was a rat race. And when Sam was gone, we lost our leader, because he was doing very important things. One of the greatest things that happened after we got acquired was Sam didn't have to do that anymore. Sam could be with us at our side, working on the product, working on what we were doing and development of the company. And that was a huge win for us because he didn't have to worry about where our next dollar was going to come from. He could work on what we were trying to do. And I think that was the biggest change that we had. We are otherwise exactly the same. We have a totally independent subsidiary of BrainLab. So we work with, whoever we want. There's no restrictions on that. And it's been fantastic because we don't have to worry about that run rate. We don't have to worry about where the next dollar is coming. And luckily we can weather some of these changes that happened throughout the pandemic. The other thing that great happened during the pandemic was, obviously they're in Munich, Germany, and our company essentially went remote. A lot of people were in Chicago. I myself was in Chicago, and now I was able to move to New York. We had a big group in Seattle. And so it enabled us to actually create this sort of global company, because now we have people, in Germany, we had people in London, we had people all over, and it just created this different culture that has been very fruitful and very beneficial for us.
That's awesome. And from what I understand, BrainLab it's like a surgical navigation company, and among other technologies. Have you guys thought about going into that kind of space at all, like integrating with some of their existing technology, like the navigation tools and things like that?
Absolutely. I mean, we've looked at all the ways that we can integrate and sort of think about how can our tools enable their tools at the point of care. And I think there's a lot of discussions around how that happens. We've created solutions for BrainLab to basically train on their devices. So we have some stuff that's out in the ecosystem right now that is specifically training on some BrainLab equipment so that people know how to use it. BrainLab is a technology company at the end. Like, yes, they were started in sort of the spine or the brain and cranial space and sort of the neurosurgical space. But now they're in radiation oncology. They're in a bunch of different spaces, but they're also a parent company for a bunch of really awesome, crazy technology companies. And they're leveraging all those companies to think about what does the future hold for technology at the point of care in surgical and procedural suites. And I think that's the really cool thing of being part of that and trying to enable that and trying to train people on how to interface with that has been such a great experience for us and has really pushed us to be able to think future proof. What is next? What can we do with the technology?
That's really awesome. I'm curious, over, as you look ahead over the next like 12 months or so, I guess, what are you most excited about with the company, the technology you guys are working on, and what are you guys hoping to achieve in that time period?
Yeah, I mean, we're going into new specialties all the time. So, we sort of have what we call our core games, which is our games that are, completely free, are really big blockbuster games. Top Derm was our last one, and our next one's going to be spine surgery. So, spine's going to be really awesome, and we're going to be able to create some really cool models. We've been working with some stuff with augmented reality and our spine game, and really trying to figure out, how do we use the tools that we have to pretty much make any model, any anatomic structure. And what I'm really excited about is the way that we can enable our technology to not just make things, but also create models and things that will create opportunities for us to do new specialties, right? So although it's in a spine, although we did ultrasound for intravenous ultrasound for cardiac, we're now using point of care ultrasound for NASA and SpaceX, right? So like we really understand how the technology can enable future opportunities. And that is what we're excited about, is where can we go next? And our partners and our clients have been fantastic. And just looking to go into new specialties and provide that opportunity for new learners to experience our stuff and push the field forward. We know that we're part of a big group in this space. And really, like I said before, it's all about collaboration. We just want to create this niche within the medical education technology space and be there with other people to push this field forward. So we move away from that paternalistic, that traditionalistic medical education to understand how technology can enable the future learning in medicine.
That's really innovative and really exciting stuff. That's awesome. I'm excited to see what comes next for Level X. That's really cool. I guess as we round out here, I definitely want to ask you, I guess, about being a physician and then an entrepreneur. And I guess, how do you, obviously you've carved out time in your schedule, but I guess, it may be hard, I'm sure, to continuously silo those two worlds, if you will. I guess, how do you make that balance? And I guess, do you have any advice on doing that?
I'll tell you, it's been hard. I've done it now at 2 or 3 institutions where I had to come in and say, I'm going to work part-time clinical and an academic practice, but also do this technology stuff. And they're like, what? So my biggest advice to you is read your contract, because, a lot of academic places just don't know how to handle that conversation. And I've had to sort of blaze that conversation with academia because, traditionally they don't like people doing a lot of outside things. And especially, I'm an employee of Level X. I'm not a consultant. So it's a whole different ballgame when you're talking about that as well. And then I have my own sort of consulting company that I work with outside clients as well, that's also carved out. And it was really tough to have those conversations. But the way that I bide my time, or the way that I create my time is I do keep them separate. Like I'm very big on telling everybody, if I get a position in a technology committee, I'm like, hey, I work for this company. These are the other companies I consult for. Just want to be blatantly transparent. And I manage those conflicts of interest. I'll submit my slides ahead of time, because academia is so super sensitive about that, which understandably so. They want things to be objective. They want things to be balanced. And I'm all about that. I very rarely, when I'm doing academic talks, bring up Level X. If somebody asks about it, I will, but very rarely do I do. But I do bring in the knowledge that I've gained by working at Level X about games and technology and education. And that has been really ubiquitous in my life through all of the different ways that I spend my time. But we know when I'm a doctor, I'm a doctor. I'm not really doing other things. And I'm always a doctor first. I'm a husband first. I'm a husband and a son and a brother. But then I'm a doctor. And then, I also have this other stuff that I really love doing, and it's interesting. And you said, how do you spend your time? And for me, having a really tough day operating and having clinic and then making video games the next day is a really good prevention of burnout. So it's actually been really good. And I have to say that I have a very understanding wife who's very supportive and probably glaring at me right now. But that's really what it takes. It takes, understanding people, having partners clinically that understand and support me, and a supportive wife.
That's awesome. I guess that the last question I want to ask you that I ask everybody is when you're not doing level X or practicing ENT, how do you find that balance? Do you have any, passions or pursuits outside of work?
Yeah. I mean, my wife and I love to travel, and I like to read. So that's always been my two go-tos, and obviously, spending time with family, but traveling is always been my travel bug. I try to do, a couple trips a year somewhere completely new that I've never been. And that's really what getting away and learning new cultures and eating different foods has really been sort of my love and my passion. But reading, I've done a lot of reading lately, and I realize in this space, especially, there's just so many books, you can never read everything. So I've actually gotten into audiobooks because it's a lot better use of my time. So when I'm commuting and stuff, it's a good way to get through some really good books that I otherwise wouldn't have time to read.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big Audible fan, the Amazon app.
I'm a huge Audible. Yeah, I'm a huge Audible. I like, and I listen at 2X. One of the things I talk about a lot is that why aren't medical students coming to class? And you're like, well, they could watch it at 2X at home if they're recorded, so they can get the same content in half the time. They're like, well, why would they do that? It was because they can, and they can get half their time back. So, I realized that I can get through more content if I train my brain to be able to do a little faster. Some of the heavier books, I can't do that. I do it like 1.5X, but just the opportunity to be able to read and get through it with the fantastic performances that are on Audible. I listened to Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's not even like, it's not even, I strongly recommend it. It's fantastic. The production quality is great. But, I listened to Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. I'm reading, Dale Carnegie. I just read. I'm reading, seven Habits of Highly Effective People, reading, quote unquote. So it's been a great way for me to consume that content.
That's awesome. That's really cool. I guess the last thing is to, help promote Level X. I guess, where can people find out more about it? Where can people, connect with the company and connect with you as well?
Yeah, we're on all social media, but our website is www.levelex.com. And so you can also find us on Twitter at Level X Team. We're also on Facebook and Instagram. We're pretty much everywhere. You can also find me on Twitter at Eric Gant, at Eric Gant, and obviously on LinkedIn as well. But I really appreciate you having me on. This was a fantastic conversation, and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I appreciate you coming on and taking time out of your busy schedule.
Anytime.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DaVinci Hour podcast, presented by DaVinci Academy. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your podcast platform of choice to catch the latest episodes. Please leave a comment or a review and share it with a friend. Lastly, you can find all of our podcasts, video courses, and books on our website, dviacademy.com. Thank you for listening.